There we go. Okay. Good morning. Shabbat Tov. Welcome, everybody. Not quite yet. Shabbat Tov. Welcome back. We are continuing Tzurba Marabanan series, volume 17. We're going way through Hilchot Shabbat. I'll just let you know, by the way, it's very exciting. This week, volume 19 is going to the printers. Yeah, we have a lot cut out ahead of us. We are going through the final details of the Zachor element of Shabbat. We've spoken about Kiddush, we've spoken about Hadlakat Nerot, we've spoken about Sudot Shabbat. The truth is, we'll come back to Sudot Shabbat a little bit today. We'll see in the context of Havdalah, we'll discuss. We are currently on Shir number 4. We're going to start on page 166 in the book. We're dealing with the halachot of Havdalah and Motza'ei Shabbat. Just before we do that, so last week we spoke at length about how we calculate the end of Shabbat and Ben Hashmashot and Shkia and Sefer Kochavim, etc. We learned about Shitat Rabbeinu Tam, etc. Without getting into all the technicalities, but I think getting a good overview in terms of what the machloket is and why it exists. It's come to my attention, a number of people mentioned on Shabbat, that not everybody is familiar with the different times and the halakha in terms of the day. So just very, very quickly, just to give a brief overview and a recap in terms of the times we have of Shabbat. And it's particularly relevant now throughout the summer months, right? We said, so without getting into everything we did last week, but we know that we have Shkia, and then we have Sefer Kochavim. Essentially, we have sunset and nightfall, right? The time before sunset, before Shkia, according to everybody, that is day. There is no machloket about that. The time after, well, maybe. The time after nightfall, after Sefer Kochavim, is night. That is clear. The time in between is Ben Hashmashot, which is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. Therefore, we treat it the Chumrah in both directions, as in terms of at the beginning of Shabbat we treat it as night, and at the end of Shabbat we treat it as day, and that is how that works. Where things get a little bit more complicated, of course, in the summer, we have discussed this, but it's always good to jog our memories, is when we do what's called early Shabbat. Right? So that's why I said it's daytime, but we're actually treating it as nighttime. And that's where things start to get a little bit confusing. The time that's printed on the calendars and on the newsletter in terms of Hadlakat Nerot, the time of lighting candles. So that is the time that is before Shkia. Okay, this is all, before we get into early Shabbat, normal Shabbat, right, late Shabbat, whatever it is. That is so the time that we have. Every city has different minhagim, but in Yerushalayim the minhagim is 14 minutes before Shkia. So that is the time that is printed. Whenever we say Hadlakat Nerot will be at 7 o'clock, whatever it is, that time is 14 minutes before Shkia. We obviously have to light candles before Shkia, because Shkia is when Ben Hashmashot starts, and that might be nighttime. And we have to separate Shabbat, so we have to bring in Shabbat a little bit early. Bishat Hatchak, extenuating circumstances, etc., we have that 40-minute window. A person is not able to light candles immediately at the beginning of that 40 minutes. That's okay. But one certainly shouldn't be waiting 39 minutes to go and light. But that is the time. That is the time when we're meant to bring in Shabbat normally. That includes a built-in Tosefet, but that is what. Now, we come to Shul, we come to Daven Mincha. We can Daven Mincha within that 40-minute window as well. That's fine, because that is still daytime. We need to accept Shabbat before some moments, some minutes before Shkia. And that's ordinary Shabbat. What happens with early Shabbat? So, as you can see, this is already a little bit early, but early Shabbat is essentially, we don't want to wait till 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night to start our meal. The kids are going to fall asleep, we're going to fall asleep, whatever it is, we want to start earlier. So we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to extend that. As we've discussed before, how far back can we go? How can we extend it? So this is the time, what's called Plag HaMincha. Right? So Plag HaMincha, as we said, is, in terms of Shot Zmaniot, an hour and a quarter before the end of the day. But the time of Plag HaMincha is based on the machloket we've discussed in the past. Won't get into it again. Based on machloket Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. But essentially, that is the earliest time. That is still daytime. That is well before Shkia. But that is the earliest time that we can light candles. So Plag HaMincha, and then of course, if we want, that's also the earliest time we can accept Shabbat, and we can daven Ma'ariv. So the way we're makpid over here, and many places are, is that we will daven Mincha will be some moments before Plag HaMincha, so that it's not total disatre, and then Kabbalat Shabbat and Ma'ariv, etc. will daven after Plag HaMincha. Okay, so that is what. So when it appears on the newsletter, you'll see that there is a time of Hadlakat Nerot, which is the later time, and then it will say the time of Plag HaMincha, and then it will say that the earliest time, the woman lighting, bringing in early Shabbat, should light at some point after Plag HaMincha. So essentially, it's at some point after the time of Plag HaMincha, before
everybody comes home from shul, that is the time when one would light candles then. And although that is still day, but that is what we consider to be the beginning of Shabbat. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies that. So now further clarification if anybody requires, but a few questions that come in about that. So that's actually
very quickly.
make that point.
Once we come to our early Shabbat,
Yes.
and we've brought Shabbat in for ourselves.
Yes.
The period of time available for women if they want to light before husbands brought in their Shabbat.
Yeah.
It's very, very narrow indeed.
Yeah, so
Right. If I go to the aluminium and I
yes.
bring in Shabbat and we get to Borikala or whichever it happens to be,
Right.
at that point, I've brought in Shabbat.
Yeah.
So Shabbat takes effect on my life as well.
Okay,
She has to have lit.
So the question was, I'll just repeat the question for the people on Zoom, which is, or I'm watching later on YouTube, the when we bring in early Shabbat. So at the time, the question was when the man brings in Shabbat in shul with the Chadodi or whatever it is, at that moment, is that when the wife has to light candles at home, or is that when Shabbat begins? So we did discuss this in the past. And again, there are poskim who hold that the whole bite is nigra. The person who is davening accepting Shabbat is at that point accepting Shabbat for the entire household. There are poskim who are not as strict regarding this, but it's essentially what we've said is you don't have to be standing there with a stopwatch. You don't have to come and work out. Okay, we get to 13 and a half minutes after we start mincha is the time we get to the Kabbalat Shabbat. Whatever, that's the time you have to light. No, we don't have to be so precise about it. Certainly. Should not be the case that a man is coming home from shul and he walks in and Shabbat hasn't been taken in, the candles haven't been lit. That is inappropriate. So it should certainly be before he comes home. It's best to try and estimate more or less around the same time lighting candles before the husband has brought in Shabbat. But if it's a few minutes after or whatever, then that is okay. We're not concerned with that. Okay, so. Fast forward now that's the beginning of Shabbat. Let's fast forward back to the end of Shabbat, right? Like I say, many people I know are avoiding the shir at the moment because we love Shabbat so much. We don't want to talk about Motza'ei Shabbat. That's all right. They say in the army, right? They call Shabbat, yesh Motza'ei Shabbat. But what can we do? It has to come at some point. The good news is, a week later, it's going to be another Shabbat. Okay, so we're on page 166. 166, we're starting to talk about Havdalah. Now, the question is, as we often ask, is Havdalah a mitzvah d'oraita or midrabanan? And surprisingly, the answer is Machloket. You guys are getting good, right? Machloket. So says the Rambam over here in Sefer Mitzvot number 17. Amru gam ken kacho b'knisato v'kacho b'yetziato. Klomar havdalah shehi gam ken chelek mischirat Shabbat mitukenet u'mitzvah. Sorry, anybody know how to turn these lights on?
I mean, I can play. I have no idea offhand.
Oh, do you know where the switches for these lights?
I have this stuff in the closet in the Mac here.
Thanks,
right.
It's a little bit dark here, so it's difficult to read, but in any event. Okay, so essentially we learned before when it comes to the of Kiddush, we saw that's actually learned out from the Shabbat, from the Pasuk. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'Kodesh. You see the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, the next source, number 18. So mitzvah tasei min haTorah l'kadesh Yom HaShabbat b'dvarim shneimar Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'Kodesh. We saw there was that Pasuk was brought in the Gemara. Again, there's a machloket in the Rishonim. Is this actually a chiyuv d'oraita necessarily, or is it some sort of an asmachta? But klomar zochre zchirat Shabbat v'kiddush v'sarich lezochra b'knisiyato v'yetziato. Says the Rambam, need to remember Shabbat, right? You need to mark it at its entry and at its departure. Right? That is an addition. The Gemara just says b'knisato. The Rambam says b'yetziato as well. That is referring to Havdalah. It may be that probably that the Rambam has a different girsa in the Gemara. Yeah, there are other Rishonim who have different girsa as well, and therefore we learn out from the pasuk that it is b'yetziato. So that might indicate that Havdalah is the oraita. Okay, it may also be asmachta ba'alma. So it's not necessarily a proof one way or the other, but it is a support for the idea that the oraita, and we can see that is how the Rambam. Now the Hilchot Chaim quotes here the Rash, who's another of the Rishonim, of Shimshon Mishans, and he says that no, Havdalah is not the oraita, it's the Rabbanan. He says even if you have that version of the text. Okay, if we we'll have to make do with what we have in terms of lines. But so he says, you'll see in source number 19, he says, this is really an asmachta be'alma. Now there is going to be potentially a very, very big nafkamina, a very big practical ramification, whether we say here that Havdalah is Doraita or that it's Rabbanan. And also potentially where we learn it out Doraita. I'm just showing you the Rambam, who says from Zachorit Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho. The Maggid Mishnah points out there is another Gemara. There is another pasuk where we may in fact learn it from. If you have a look at the next page, source number 20. Well, like we said, the Rambam clearly says that the same mitzvah Doraita. Says the Maggid Mishnah over here, he quotes the Gemara Psachim. That's what we've seen already. But then he says in bold, Mikom Makom Yofina Nem Dichtiv Ula Havdil. Right, there's a pasuk, the Gemara in Shavuot quotes the pasuk, says the Havdil Min HaKodesh Ben Kol. And that is a separate pasuk. What's significant over there is that pasuk is not related to Zachoret Yom HaShabbat or Shamoret Yom HaShabbat. We'll see in a moment what the practical ramification is. If you go back to source number 19, and the Rash he alludes to this. He says, Katava Rash Zal, Nashim Ein Mavdilot La'atzmam. The Ein Havdalah Tluya B'Shmirat Shabbat. Okay, what does that mean? Havdalah is not dependent. It doesn't mean Havdalah is not dependent on Shabbat observance. It's how they've translated it here. But no, what it means is, we know we have two psukim, Zachoret Yom HaShabbat and Shamor. And as we've discussed in the past, that those two are connected, right? But those two are connected halachically. And we say that Gemara says anybody who's obligated in Shamor is obligated in Zachor. And this is why women are obligated in many of the positive mitzvot of Shabbat. Why is a woman obligated in Kiddush? That's according to everybody. Even though Kiddush is derived from Zachoret Yom HaShabbat Lekadsho, and that is a positive time-bound mitzvah. Normally we say women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvah. However, where Zachor is tied to Shamor, Shamor is a negative mitzvah, and just as anybody who's obligated in that negative mitzvah is obligated in the positive as well. And therefore the nafkamina would be as follows. If we learn out the obligation of Havdalah from the fact that it says Zachoret Yom HaShabbat, which is connected to Shamoret Yom HaShabbat, well, then we would say that women are obligated in Havdalah. If we say no, it's a mitzvah d'oraita, but it's learned out from elsewhere, it's learned out from the pasuk of Lahavdil, so then maybe women are not obligated. What if we say not like the Rambam, but like the other Rishonim who say that this is a mitzvah the Rabbanan? Did Rabbanan extend the obligation of Havdalah onto women as well? So you could say yes, and you could say no. You could say that they call the takun Rabbanan kain d'oraita takun, meaning whatever Rabbanan established, they did it in a way that mirrors the Torah obligations, and in the same way we have a Torah obligation of Zachor, they extended that and women would be included as well, or not. Okay, so these are the different sides. So this is a big machloket, whether women are obligated to recite Havdalah or not, and there would be a number of nafkamina that would come out of it. Number one, right, is a woman obligated? Does a woman have to go in here Havdalah? That's the first question. Second question is, who's making Havdalah? Is a woman allowed to make Havdalah for herself? Okay, for others? Everybody's going to agree that a woman cannot make Havdalah for a man. Unlike Kiddush, where if it's necessary and because there is the same level of chiyuv, here by Havdalah, it's not so clear that a woman has the same level of chiyuv, and therefore a woman cannot make Havdalah for a man. But can a woman make Havdalah for herself? Can a man who has already heard Havdalah, already made Havdalah, then go and make Havdalah for a woman, for his wife, for example? Right? That's going to be a question. And the corollary of that would be who has to make Havdalah in shul, right? So it's not so clear. All these questions are related. We see this other places as well. For example, when it comes to shofar and Rosh Hashanah. So shofar and Rosh Hashanah, we know that is a positive time-bound mitzvah. Women are not obligated to hear, although in many communities women have accepted upon themselves the obligation, or women try and go to hear the shofar and Rosh Hashanah, but strictly speaking, it's not required. And therefore, what happens when a man is blowing the shofar for a woman? So if he has not yet heard the shofar, and he, in blowing the shofar, is fulfilling his own mitzvah as well, so then there's no question. He can do it, he can say the bracha, he can do everything. If he's already fulfilled the mitzvah, and now he's going to blow shofar again for a woman who has not heard it, so then we would say, ultimately we pass on that it's allowed, okay, due to the principle of, maybe because of avot, or because of other reasons, but he would not be able to say the bracha again because he's already fulfilled the mitzvah. So then one of the women would have to say the bracha. A woman allowed to blow the shofar for themselves. So it's a very similar discussion to what we have here by Havdalah as well. So says the Magid Mishnah, source number 21, at the bottom of page 167. He says, But if we say that it's a Doraita obligation, so then women would have an obligation, the same way that we saw from Zachor. If it's midrabanan, so maybe then we'll say that it is Rabbanan established it in the same way as they established as the mitzvah doraita, and therefore there would be an obligation. Rabbeinu in this case is the Rambam, right? Magid Mishnah is a commentary on the Rambam. Satam kan v'kan, he didn't specify. V'kevan shelo is killed by him. He didn't specify. He didn't say women are exempt from Havdalah, and therefore you can infer miklal shem chayavot. You can infer that they are obligated. So that seems to be so. The Rambam himself says that Havdalah is a mitzvah doraita. The Magid Mishnah says he doesn't specify whether women are exempt or not. The Magid Mishnah says whether you accept the Rambam then as doraita, even if you say it's Rabbanan, women will be obligated, and certainly according to the Rambam they will be obligated. But as we said, not everybody agrees, as we explained why. It says the Shulchan Aruch, top of page number 20, source 22. Nashim chayavot b'avdalah, nashim chayavot b'kiddush, v'yesh mi shecholek. Okay, that's the Shulchan Aruch. He says the women are obligated, just like in Kiddush, but yesh mi shecholek. There is a dissenting view. We know that according to the Klalei Psat, when the Shulchan Aruch brings stam and yesh omrim, we go by stam. So he's bringing us that opposing view because it is significant, but he seems to hold the first view. Says the Rama, okay, lo yavdilu latzman, like yishma'u avdalah min ha'anashim. And he says, therefore, says the Rama, we are concerned for this dissenting view, and therefore women should not say Havdalah for themselves, rather they should hear it from a man. That is where possible. Now, so as you can see, we have a doubt over this. We have those who say certainly women are obligated. It doesn't seem to filter through to the later poskim the opinion of the other extreme, which is that women would be exempt. I would not have to hear it. Right? We're holding it from both sides. We're saying we are assuming that women need to hear Havdalah, but we're concerned that they should not say it for themselves. Why is that? Because they mitzvah asay shazman gram. Now you could say, wait a minute, I don't understand. Right? Certainly for Ashkenazi women, whenever I have a mitzvah asay shazman grama, so even if a woman is not obligated, right, if she wants to fulfill it, she can. Tkir shofar, right, lulav, Sfirat HaOmer, whatever it is. Sfirat HaOmer is a different discussion. But this is a machlokes Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, and the Sfaradim generally say that women should not say a bracha, because how can you say Sheket Shem Mitzvot Tzivani? Right? Maybe by Havdalah it's easier because there is no bracha in Havdalah that is a Sheket Shem Mitzvot Tzivani. So if women, even if we say the women are exempt, if they want to say Havdalah for themselves, what's the problem? Says the Magen Abraham over here, and he quotes the Bach. So the Bach says, even though you say they are exempt, why can't you say it's just like any other mitzvah shazman grama that the woman say Havdalah for herself if she wants to? That even if, okay, so this is the Bach. The Magen Abraham is quoting the Bach. He says even if there are men there who could say the Havdalah for them, let the women say the bracha themselves. What's the big deal? Now the Magen Abraham himself answers. If dedat lama b'mitzvah shesh ba'asiyah rasha'in la'asot levarech. Where do we say that if it's a mitzvah to say shazman grama, the woman wants to perform a sheh? That's where it's a mitzvah. Where there is something to do. You pick up a lulav, you go and hear the shofar. There's an action, right? But where there is no, you say, because there's an action, therefore you can say the bracha. But where there is no action, where the bracha itself, that is the mitzvah, kegon kan, ein lashaot, maybe not. Says maybe that's the reason why women are not makpid on kiddush levana, because that's just an actual, again, with speech rather than an actual act of the mitzvah. Okay, but in any event, says the Magen Abraham, Says the Magen Avraham, that is, I think that we follow the Bach. In other words, that a woman who wants to make Havdalah, there is also, the Mishnah Berurah points out, that there is also a minhag for women not to drink. Various reasons are brought. Some of them are halachic, some of them are more mystical.
Yeah, and I'm looking up something. You go ahead, I'll get back
Okay,
to something.
and it is brought that there is a custom for women not to drink the wine or grape juice at Havdalah. So then, can a woman make Havdalah if she's not able to drink the the wine? So the Aruch HaShulchan over here, source number 25, he says, Ra'iti Misha Iksha, I've seen those who ask this question, because Havdalah. And he says, he says, I found this question astonishing. There's no halacha that a woman is not allowed to drink the wine from Havdalah. There's no one else to drink. She can drink. Right? So there's a minhag, and not everybody has the minhag. Says obviously, he says, if a woman makes Havdalah, she can drink the wine, and Shalom Alisram. That's the end of it. There is another discussion. What about the bracha Borei Morei Ha'esh? Why would that be separate from all the other brachot of Havdalah? Right? Because our entire discussion over here is regarding mitzvat aseh shazman grama, and at the end of the day, you might say that it's either that it's connected to zachor, that it's not intrinsically connected to the idea of time, but the bracha of Borei Morei Ha'esh, the bracha on the candle. Why do we have that? As you all know, right? We're coming up, we'll have Shavuot soon. When we do Havdalah on Shavuot, Havdalah of Chagim, we don't use the candle. Yom Kippur is separate. But because Esh was created on Motza'ei Shabbat, so it's something that's intrinsically connected to the time-bound element. So therefore, maybe that is separate. Have a look. Bir Halacha, source number 26 says, "Mistapakna afilu lo man daman nashim chayavot b'Havdalah." Even according to those who say a woman would be obligated in Havdalah, im chayavot b'Birkat HaNer, would they have to have the bracha Borei Morei Ha'esh? The bishlama Havdalah. That Havdalah, even though it is time bound, but it's, as we said, it's tied up to the mitzvah of Zachor, and therefore that's why we say. And he says, even according to those who say it's Rabbanan, you might still be obligated. Right, I'm skipping a few lines. He then says, "Masha en ken ner shenitkana briat ha'ol b'motzei Shabbat." Briat ha'ol. Right, when it comes to now, that is related to the fact of fire that was created on Motza'ei Shabbat. This actually has nothing to do with Shabbat. Certainly has nothing to do with Zachor. Right? V'hiz man grama manalan d'chayavot, who says that he obligated. And then he says something which some of the later poskim will say, but the Bir Halacha rejects. He says, don't say, okay, well, it's part of the nusach of Havdalah, and therefore you say all the brachot together. He says, no. You could say that bracha by itself, theoretically. Where do we, right? We have an example where we do that. For example, when you have Tisha B'Av, which falls out on Shabbat or on Motzei Shabbat, you have to, right? So then we can only do, we postpone Havdalah until after Tisha B'Av, Havdalah HaKos. But we say the bracha Borei Morei Ha'esh by itself on Motzei Shabbat. So you could say it by itself. If you don't have fire, you still make Havdalah without it. Nonetheless, maybe because it's the proper way to do it, you have all the brachot together, maybe we would say this. Nonetheless, top of page 170 says, יותר נכון לומר, says the ביור הנחה, חפץ חיים, יותר נכון לומר, דאינה חייבת בברכת הנר לכולי עלמא. Okay, so that is quite far-reaching, says the Bir Halacha, even according to those who say that women are obligated in Havdalah, would not be obligated in Birkat HaNer. Shemrat Shabbat Kelchata, Paskins the same way. He says, Isha she'ein la mi sheyotzia yedei chovat Havdalah. There's no man to make Havdalah, so the woman will make Tavdil atzma, v'tishteh min hayayin, and she can drink from the wine. Kedei lo levater mitzvot Havdalah, aval lo tavarech al hanem. He says, but she should do it without a cap. As I said, not everybody agrees. We have here Rav Moshe Feinstein, who he actually rejects this, and he says the following. Source number 28 says, "Right? What's his proof? He says you look at he goes in and he discusses why it would be this way. But if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, what did he say? He said, Nashim chayavot be'avdala, Shem chayavot be'kiddush.
Doesn't make a distinction.
Shulchan Aruch said, women are obligated in Havdalah. He didn't say part of Havdalah, he said 2/3 of Havdalah, with this bracha, without the bracha. No. Shulchan Aruch said, chayavot be'avdalah means chayavot be'avdalah. So there we have it. So we have opinions that say women are obligated in Havdalah, and that is the Shulchan Aruch, right? There is a dissenting opinion, and therefore that said the Ramah. Ideally, woman should not make Havdalah for herself. Somebody else, a man, should make it. If a woman is going to make Havdalah, and as we have seen, there is what to rely on, either because she's obligated, like anybody else, or even if she's not obligated, we could say, like any other mitzvah, to say Shazman Grama, she can fulfill it herself. What about the bracha of Borei Marei Esh? So according to the Biur Halacha, Shmat Shabbat Hilchot, she should not say it. According to Moshe Feinstein, she should say it, and that seems to be the pshat really of the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, what about? So that is in terms of a woman making Havdalah for herself. So as we've seen, that's actually going to be the easiest. If a man has already heard Havdalah, let's think about this. The man made Havdalah in shul, or he heard Havdalah in shul. This is why, by the way, man, if you when you hear Havdalah in shul, you should have in mind not to be Yotzei that Havdalah. So you can go home and make Havdalah again for the household with your wife, and that is L'kulei alma. There is no issue there. But let's say he forgot and he intended to be Yotzei through shul, or he was the only person in shul who knew how to make Havdalah, and therefore he said it. And then when he goes home, so now what should you do? So based on what we've seen so far, it would seem the best thing to do in such a situation is therefore the woman can then make Havdalah for herself. There's no pitfall with that. Seems to be better than the man making Havdalah again. Shmat Shabbat Hilchot number 29. He says, Ish asher kvar avdil la'atzmo, u'shema Havdalah me'acher or beit hakneset v'yatzeh derech chovato. Right? A man has already fulfilled the obligation of Havdalah. Machloket ha'poskimi im mutar lo la'avdil b'shvil ha'isha. This is a machloket. V'lachen, im en sham ish shelo avdil adayin, mutav shetavdil hi la'atzma. And in such a situation, there's no man who can make Havdalah, the woman should make it. Tov yaseh ha'ish im yikaven lo la'tzeit b'Havdalah asher mavdilim beit hakneset. Better still, don't have in mind, this doesn't mean you have to leave shul early. You can stay till the end, but just have in mind not to, and now you're telling me, so why do we make Havdalah in shul in the first place? Okay, there are people who need it. So that's, we're not going to change that many.
He does make a point here of saying that if she makes it by herself, she doesn't make on a candle.
You're saying
like before that she should not use a candle, right? And here it doesn't she doesn't make that.
That's in the previous sif.
In the sif,
that right. Is in the previous sif. Yeah, that's in number two.
So the assumption is in this case that she would not.
I mean, it's the Shmat Shabbat Hilchot.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
right.
But as we've seen, there's room to agree with that. Too. In any event, Tov yaseh ha'ishim kamen lo natzeh b'Havdalah. Have in mind not to fulfill. So you can say it again at home. And he can
what's the implication of like lo tzad techova? In other words, if you decide you're not seeing anything, so you can make it home, but you have to take your car home from shul or something like that, you can't, or like.
Oh, we'll get to that. You're asking a separate question. Question is when Shabbat is out,
right?
Somebody always asks this question. When can I begin to? Is the restriction against performing malacha from the time that I've made Havdalah or not? Okay, we'll get to that. It's an important question. Yudchet, he says, the next sif, a woman who is making Havdalah for herself can have in mind, can discharge the obligation for another woman. But a woman cannot make Havdalah on behalf of a man. Again, the reason why one person can make a bracha, fulfill a mitzvah on behalf of another, is based on the principle of arvut, which we spoke about last week. It was in this week's parasha. But arvut applies where both people have an equal obligation, right? So here, where we have a safek, I mean, if we knew, right, that a woman was fully obligated in the same, according to those poskim, when a woman is obligated like a man, according to those poskim, a woman would be able to make Havdalah off of man as well. Problem is, we're not sure that is correct, and therefore that's why we would not rely on this. Okay, number 30, shut or letzion or ben Tzion Abba Shaul. Chen hagush av ma'bar kvar avdil sheyachol leavdil leishto letzii ota b'chol seder Havdalah. So he says again, based on the Shulchan Aruch. Based on the fact of if we say that a woman is obligated, it's not just a chumrah, it's a kul. Right? If we say that a woman is obligated, that means that a man who's already fulfilled his obligation can now do Havdalah again. And that seems to be the Pshat of the Shulchan Aruch, and therefore Rav Abba Shaul says that is okay.
Look at the Mikol Makom.
And Mikol Makom, Tov L'Katchila, Shet Birkat HaNer, Tevarech HaIsha B'Atzma. So that's very interesting. That's Hafuk and Hafuk. In any event, the bottom line is that best to avoid all sveikot is that the man should not have fulfilled his obligation. He could say Havdalah on behalf of his wife as well. If there is a situation whereby a woman does not know how to say Havdalah, she's unable to for whatever reason, and the only person who can say Havdalah is the man, and he's already heard it. So nonetheless, we would say in such a situation, you can go back, make Havdalah again, based on it on the Psak of the Shulchan Aruch. Okay. Next topic on page 172 is about activities prohibited before Havdalah. We'll get to Melacha as well, but there's a big sugya regarding eating and drinking, and this comes up. This is Masim B'cholim every week when we have Sudah Shlishit. The custom in many places that Sudah Shlishit begins quite late in the day. We continue eating after Shkia, and the truth is that it's not the issue in terms of eating after Shkia is not that in and of itself is not a problem necessarily. The problem is we're getting close to Havdalah and we're not allowed to perform activities before Havdalah that are going to in the same way that really every day before Knesset Shabbat, certain things you can't do at the time of Kriyat Shema, right? Half an hour before Kriyat Shema, half an hour before Mincha time, the Quran Shema talks about certain activities we're not allowed to be engaged in because they may drag on and we may not come to do what will fulfill our obligation. Dikat Chametz is another one. Everybody knows when the night of Dikat Chametz, when the time comes for Dikat Chametz, you're not allowed to start a meal, you're not allowed to go to a shir, you're not allowed to do all sorts of things. We're concerned. The person sits down to learn Torah, you're going to get open up Tzuma B'Rabanan. How are you going to be able to close it? How are you going to be able to stop? So that's a concern over there, unless you have different mechanisms in place to make sure that you stop at the right time and fulfill the obligation that you have. But eating and drinking before Havdalah, again, is going to be a problem because we're concerned that you'll carry on. Either different explanations are given. One might be that the person won't stop, and then you'll forget to go in to do Havdalah. There may be other reasons as well, and this is we have the Gemara in Psachim, source number 31 says Rav Chananya bar Shlamya v'talmidei de Rav havuyatve b'sudat. They were sitting and having a meal. V'kai alay Rav Imnu Nasaba Amru lei zil chazi maktish yoma nafsik v'nikbai l'shabta. So it seems to be they were eating a meal on Friday, meaning before Shabbat. And they said, let's go and see if the night has come, if it's already Shabbat, if we have to stop. And he says, no, you don't have to stop. Shabta kava nafsha. Shabbat establishes itself. If you carry on eating, that's already considered a Shabbat meal. There's a whole sugya in and of itself, and Parishma Pama Kadesh. We're not going to get into that discussion now. But the point is that the continuation. It says, Savu mine, ki heichi de kava lekidush, kach kava lehavdalah. In other words, that the implication seems to be that if a person was eating, again, on Shabbat afternoon, they would not have to stop before Havdalah. And Amar Rav Amram, Hachi Amarav lekidush kovat v'lo Havdalah kovat. In other words, that is different. When it comes to time for Havdalah, you're going to have to stop. There's always, whenever we have this kind of discussion in the Gemara, we always ask the question: is there a distinction between stopping something you've already started or starting in the first place? Says the Gemara, mifsak, de lo mafsakina, aval etchule lo matchilina. In other words, we don't have to stop what the Gemara is talking about, but meaning if one was already eating, one doesn't have to stop to say Havdalah, but one would not be allowed to start. Okay, all this is relating to eating and not necessarily to drinking. Okay, then the Gemara's discussion whether drinking water, etc., is included in this or not. So let's just see the bottom line. The Shulchan Aruch, in source number 32, what he learns out from this Gemara is as follows: Asur le'achol shum davar, or afilu l'shtot yayin asham mashkim chutz mimayim, mishetechshach ad she'avdil. From the time that it gets dark until Havdalah, at that point on, you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to drink, right? With the exception of water. That's based on the continuation of the Gemara, and that is how we pass as well. Drinking water is still going to be going to be acceptable. I remember once when I was in yeshiva, so we had Seudah Shlishit, and actually the Rosh Yeshiva came in to give the Sikha at Seudah Shlishit, and I was sitting there right next to him, and I asked if he wanted a cup of tea or something. He hadn't actually eaten Seudah Shlishit. No, he hadn't eaten Seudah Shlishit with us. I think he had eaten Seudah Shlishit at home, and then he'd just come in to give the Sikha. So I asked if I could bring a cup of tea, and he looks at me and he says, "Mata." So he said he could bring me a cup of water. So that was drinking water is fine. Never forgotten the halacha since.
Yeah, right. It's insane.
It worked. But so you can't eat and you can't drink, only water, right? משתכשך עד שיבדיל. אבל אם היה יושב ואוכל מבעוד יום וחשכה לו, אינו צריך להפסיק. But if you had already begun a meal before it was dark, you had already started eating during the day, then you do not need to interrupt. Says Rama, we'll see that in a moment. One of the big questions, by the way, is what does it mean mishtechshach? Right? So we started off at the beginning. Mishtechshach. Are we talking about shkia or are we talking about Seta Kochavim? Okay, we'll have to see.
The other question is, what does it mean Yoshev Ochel? Right? Like, I mean,
and that's a very good question as well. What does it mean Yoshev Ochel? Okay. So if you've started a meal, but what's considered a meal? Does that mean you had bread? What if you're having mezonot? What's called minei targima in the Gemara, right? What if a person, we discussed before what one's obligation is to eat for Seudah Shlishit. And we said, aside from all the other reasons, that is another benefit, maybe another reason why it's better to have bread at Seudah Shlishit. Then there certainly is no question. If one had washed and eaten and started eating bread before Shkia, one can certainly continue the meal until Birkat Hamazon, however long it takes. Okay, so if you were sitting and drinking, this is what the Gemara said. It said there's a difference between eating and drinking. So you were sitting and just drinking. In other words, it wasn't a fixed meal. Okay, that you have to, sometimes you're somewhere, you're not sitting at Seudah Shlishit as such. Let's say you had your Seudah Shlishit earlier, whatever, you're sitting drinking tea, or you're sitting around the table, or not sitting in the lounge, and everybody's having a snack or whatever. So that you would have to stop. When it's coming close to the end of Shabbat. יש אומרים דהנה מילי בספק חשיכה, אבל בוודאי חשיכה, אפילו היושב ואוכל, פורס מבא מבדיל וגומר סעודתו. Right, that's what we saw before. Are we talking about when it's spek chashecha, in other words, ben hashmashot, or are we talking about vadai chashecha, when it's nightfall? Okay, that's the difference. And says Rama, v'minhag hapashut kisvara rishona, that one would not need to interrupt the meal even once it's already nightfall. Okay, so now we have the Taz over the page, source 33. We won't read the whole thing. Quite a long piece here. He brings two different opinions in the Rishonim. Again, as we said, there's an opinion, that this idea of having to stop or not being able to start eating would already begin at Shkia, and there are those who say that it's already from that it's only later from nightfall. So if you have a look at the last paragraph in the Taz, he says, Nimsa, there are two nafkamina that are going to come out of this, i.e. regarding when one has to start, when one's allowed to start, and when one will have to stop. So since the Rama wrote at the end that our stringency is only when it's already dark, so we are therefore going to be maker in terms of safek chashecha and ben hashmashot. Again, in other words, says the Taz, we have your limud zchut for those who would start eating Seudah Shlishit even after Shkia, even washing just after Shkia. There is room to rely on over there. Not everybody agrees. Not everybody agrees. The Magen Avraham, for example, and the Mishnah Brura, he says mishtechshach afilu bisfek chashecha. He says no, even from ben hashmashot, that's when you should not start eating. Mikol makom nirali tinyan achilat Seudah Shlishit im lo achal mikodem bevadai tzarich laachol afilu achal shkia. Since there is a chovah of Seudah Shlishit, so then okay, you didn't have before. We have here a number of different factors. We have here a safek, and therefore in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you can even start after shkia, but preferably not. Rav Nemsa over here, this relates to the discussion from last week regarding Zmanei Rabbeinu Tam and the length of Shkia, the length of Ben Hashmashot in different places. He says because in Eretz Yisrael, the whole idea of Ben Shmashot is so short, he says, no, we don't have room yet to rely on this, and therefore one should start eating beforehand. Rav Vadia Yosef is a little bit more lenient. In other words, bottom line, what comes out of this is this: one should start eating Seudah Shlishit before Shkiach. Sometimes you're in a place, sometimes Mincha takes a little bit longer and you get stuck or whatever, and it's a few minutes after. Okay, so we've seen there is what to rely on, and therefore one does not need to be, if one is in extenuating circumstances, not need to be overly concerned. Certainly if it means that now, it's a minute, 2 minutes after Shkia, especially as we know there are the machloket when Shkia actually begins, and it might not be, whatever. Therefore one should still go and wash, or one should not negate the mitzvah of Seudah Shlishit for that purpose. Okay, but that is the idea. So if one was not eating a fixed meal, one was just snacking or whatever it is, right? We get to Shkia, we get to the time it's getting close to Haftalah, one needs to stop eating, refrain from it. If one is having a fixed meal, one started eating their Seudah Shlishit, one washed before Shkia, certainly one can continue eating. Not now getting into the discussion, there's a separate discussion with Poskim regarding the brachot, Birkat Hamazon. What happens when we start? What happens when we start eating while it's still Shabbat, and then we finish off benching after nightfall? So then we would still say, according to everybody. Where it gets very complicated is when you have Rosh Chodesh, which falls out on Motza'ei Shabbat. So when I started eating, it was Shabbat and not Rosh Chodesh. When I finished eating, we still say it's Shabbat, but now it's Rosh Chodesh. Do I say Yalev Yavo or not? That is there's a big machloket, a number of different opinions in there. I remember in Yeshiva they used to have a minhag that whenever that happened, so we would finish eating early. We'd finish actually eating before Shkia, and then we'd go out and sing and whatever it was, don't turn to the kotel. That was in order to avoid getting into that safek. But now another question, and this is very, very practical, which is what if a person didn't eat bread? So what if a person wants to, you go down, you start eating 5 minutes before Shkia, your crackers and herring and tuna, whatever it is. But now it's Shkia. Now do we have to stop eating? So on the one hand, we see that there is an opinion that says you don't have to stop eating at Shkia. You only have to stop eating when you get to Tzeit HaKochavim, when you get to the time when you can do Havdalah. So that might be a sniff to rely on as well. But more importantly is what do we define as a meal? If we consider that I've started the meal, particularly if I'm saying I'm relying on the mizonot as my way of fulfilling Seudah Shlishit, so does that mean that I've started the meal before and I can continue eating? So the Aruch HaShulchan does not like this. Source number 37, he says, forget it, essentially. Right, so even though a lot of people are sitting around and drinking, whatever, that is not considered a meal. It's not a fixed meal, you need to stop. So the Gemara said if you're drinking, certainly you have to stop. He extends that. He says drinking means it's not fixed. So it's the same thing if you're sitting and eating fruit. Pitzuchim, whatever it is. He says even if it's mezonot. That's not kviyot. Dimu kviyot. If it was kviyot, you would have sat down and had bread. Since you do not do that, there's not a fixed meal, and therefore you need to stop. Now, he might be referring over here to Pata Baba Kisni. When the Aruch HaShulchan says you should have gone, you should have washed your hands and said Amotzi, we know, we actually skipped this volume, but you can go back and look it up, that there are certain types of mezonot foods, which what's called Pata Baba Kisni, which is a quasi bread, has this somewhat certain status in the middle. Which is, if I eat a small amount, a reasonable amount of it, then I would say mezonot. But if I eat a very, very large amount, it actually changes, and you would have hamotzi and you would have birkat hamazon. So he says Aruch HaShulchan, look, you said mezonot, you're not saying birkat hamazon. It doesn't count. It's not a fixed meal. What determines whether I say birkat hamazon or not? If I have the amount of a kviyat seudah, our whole discussion is a kviyat seudah, and therefore it's not that. Rabbi Abba Shaul in Olat Zion, he says actually. Maybe not so clear. Okay. It says at the end here, source number 38, since you're eating a type of food which could be have a kviyot seudah, meaning this is a significant enough food that you could carry on eating it after dark as well. There is here in the footnotes reference, footnote number 28, they quote here the response of Shevet HaLevi. So the Shevet HaLevi also says He says, if I'm eating food, right, I'm not eating hamot, I'm eating mezonot, and it might be the case even less than that, but perot and whatever. But that's how I'm having my Seudah Shlishit. I'm fulfilling the obligation. Okay? We got into the whole discussion whether one needs bread or not. But if I'm fulfilling my obligation in that way, so then okay, I could carry on eating it. It's no different to anybody else. I saw in Rav Rimon's Sefer, he brings as well, very sensitive psak, which is somebody who is has the celiac or is unable to eat gluten. Right, so somebody there, so who's Kviyat Seudah, by definition, 99% of the time, or maybe 100% of the time, depending on the severity, does not eat bread, right, or mezonot. So if it's mezonot or whatever it is, so that's your Kviyat Seudah. So that's the point. It's Kviyat Seudah. You can start and you can carry on. But the bottom line is, under ordinary circumstances, you can see a summary chart here on page 178. The Aruch HaShulchan again was very clear. Lechatchila all poskim agree. Seudah Shlishit. Lechatchila, one should eat bread, one's able to, and one should start eating bread before Shkia. Then there is no question about carrying on afterwards. If I did not eat bread, if I'm fulfilling my obligation of Seudah Shlishit by mezonot and possibly other foods as well, so we've seen there are those who say no, that doesn't help, you have to stop, and there are those who say you have what to rely on, and that would be the combination of factors of one, the fact that is my Seudah Shlishit means but it's a Kviyat Seudah, plus the fact we saw the Taz and other poskim who say that actually I don't need to stop eating until it's Tzedakah, and therefore there is what to rely on in that circumstance. But if it's just drinking, just a snack or something like that, certainly if you've already fulfilled Seudah Shlishit, that is not okay. That you would have to stop. Okay, what about melacha? The question was asked earlier: is one allowed to drive home and then do Havdalah? Right, go up in the lift, whatever it is. You haven't made Havdalah yet. So the Gemara over here in source number 39 tells us, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus Mishum Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Asur lo adam she'aseh chavatzav kodem she'avdil. Person is not allowed to go and tend to their affairs before making Havdalah. Amar le Rabbi Abba Rav Ashi b'ma'av amin anachi hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol v'avdil en sochin. So he says the way that we do this, we say hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol. And then you can go and attend to your needs. You can go and do melacha. Amar Vashi ki havina be Rav Kahana hava amar mavdil ben kodesh l'chol u'mezaltin an silti. So he would go and he would say mavdil ben kodesh l'chol and then go chop up the wood. Now, what we see from here is that there is a way. One has to distinguish in some way, right? Mavdil ben kodesh l'chol before one can perform melacha at the end of Shabbat, but there is a possibility of doing a melacha here before one's actually heard Havdalah over the course. Rashi explains source number 40. Let's just see over the page. He says 41 the Shulchan Aruch. He says asor lasot shum melacha kodem sheyavdil. Right, before I've made Havdalah, we're not allowed to perform melacha. The im yavdil batfilah mutar. Right, the Havdalah in Tefillah, that is sufficient. I don't remember if we saw it in Nisharim or not, but the Gemara does discuss how they went through different stages. I think we discussed it. That why do we have Havdalah both in the Tefillah and Havdalah over the course? Right, surely one would be enough. This leads to some confusing questions which come up sometimes. But I think we did discuss it when we learned about Hilchot Tefillah of Shabbat. And the reason is that there were different times when having a cup of wine was very, very expensive. And people were not, it was not something that everybody could afford. So therefore Chazal went and they added Havdalah and Tefillah. And they said, you're not required to go and have to Havdalah over course. And then they said, you have to go over. So then they asked the question, so why isn't it that when we have over a course that we don't say in Tefillah? And we said, no, because, if every week you're going to change the requirements of Havdalah based on what the market's gone up and the market's gone down, right. That's going to be a little bit, it's going to be a little bit difficult.
But there's still enough, not according to that, there's still enough Kamina that you said, that you shouldn't make Havdalah when you come home. Like we should still. No, you're still required. You're still required to do both.
Right. The nafkamina is going to be that if a person forgot to say Havdalah in Tefillah, okay, but then because you're saying Havdalah goes later, you don't have to go back.
Go back, right?
Okay, so that is so Shulchan Aruch says asor lasot shum melacha kodem she'avdil v'miyavdil b'tefillah mutar af al pi she'adayin lo yavdil lakos. Okay, important. If a person has said Havdalah in Tefillah, so then you can. Okay, you still have to say Havdalah at home, but you've now made Havdalah, so you can now perform melacha. That is why. This board that we have over here with Parshat HaShavua, Okay, you'll notice it's always accurate. It's amazing. This is the most accurate Parashat Shabbat board in the world. Now, many shuls, you come on a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, it's on last week's Parsha. I remember in England, when the shul was closed for 3 months, 4 months, whatever it was during COVID, we came back and we saw like what Parsha was up. It was quite,
striking.
Striking, yes. But so here, we change it. It's changed every Motza'ei Shabbat. But it's done after, it's sometimes even before Havdalah has been made here in Shul, but it's done after Tefillah. So long as we have the Shemona Esrei and you've said the Atachon Antanu, so that's Havdalah, you can now do preparation for the next week. Okay? ואם צריך לעשות מלאכה קודם שהבדיל בתפילה, אומר המבדיל בין קודש ובין החול בלא ברכה ועושה מלאכה. That's what the Gemara referred to, that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. The Rama says it like this, says, "Chen nashim שאינן מבדילים בתפילה," you have women who are not davening Mariv, so then they would, יש ללמדן שיאמרו המבדיל בין קודש לחול, that's what we do, you would say, if ברוך המבדיל בין קודש לחול, and that is sufficient, and then you can do מלאכה after that. Mishnah Berurah does point out, by the way, this allows you to do melacha, it doesn't allow you to eat. If you want to eat, you still need to do Havdalah first, with the exception of water. And one last point, this will end. The Tzitz Eliezer in source number 44 talks about, there are those who suggested that maybe saying Shavua Tov has the same effect as Baruch HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol. So we don't rely on this, ideally. This is brought out in some of the poskim. He rejects it. But where it comes up, for example, is where, let's say, one wants to travel on Motza'ei Shabbat with a non-observant taxi driver, something like that. So here you have the issue of, he hasn't, the whole day he hasn't been keeping Shabbat, okay? But that's his problem. But now he's going to drive me around in the car. He's doing that for me. Is there a problem here?
So if he says Shabbat,
because I'm causing him to desecrate Shabbat in a sense, right? Because for him it's still Shabbat because he hasn't had Havdalah. So there are those who suggested, you get into the taxi, you say Shavua Tov, and he says Shavua Tov, and that's good enough. Tzitz Eliezer is not so happy about that. He doesn't support that idea. He says he is lenient ultimately for other reasons. He says it could be the requirement for Havdalah is for a person who's going to say Havdalah. If a person is going to do Havdalah anyway, so then the Yisur Malacha would basically expire by itself when Shabbat goes out. Okay, and here's a discussion in there. In source number 44, I'll refer you to that. But Adkan for today. So that is our shir today. Next week, Bezrat Hashem, we'll carry on. Latest time for Havdalah is the next topic, and then we go into the second shir in the book about Motza'ei Shabbat and Havdalah, the order of Havdalah. What about other drinks? We'll get into a discussion of Chaimar Medina. Okay, Besamim, Brain Moray Ha'esh, of Medim Alav Malka, and then following that, that's the end of. That will probably take us 2 or 3 weeks to get through. Once we do that, we'll start getting into the shamons of Shabbat. So we've then gone through all the zachos, talk about klalei malachot, and then start going through the malachot one by one, a lot of the intricate details. So fascinating stuff coming up. Stay tuned. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you very much.
So the info is about interpretation.